So welcome everyone, good afternoon. I'm Chris Walker, Vice President for Studies and Analysis at the National Endowment for Democracy, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our panel discussion today titled Dictators Without Borders, Power and Money in Central Asia. The title of today's event is taken from a just-released important book authored by Alexander Cooley and John Heathershaw that examines the underappreciated symbiotic links between authoritarian regimes in Central Asia and the power centers of the West. So we're very pleased to host the book launch here today for those of you who haven't seen it. And I'd note books will be for sale at the back of the room, and I understand Alex may even sign them for those of you who are interested. I just note this book explores the serious challenges that have emerged from autocratic settings in an increasingly globalized world, and how actors and institutions in established democracies all too often play the role of enablers in these interactions. I would note that Alex has established himself as one of the leading thinkers on the influence of what could be called authoritarian internationalism. He contributed among the most insightful and thought-provoking articles to a Journal of Democracy book titled Authoritarianism Goes Global: The Challenge to Democracy, that was published last year. In his piece, which itself was titled Countering Democratic Norms, he skillfully dissects the ways in which authoritarian regimes are reshaping international norms to the detriment of democratic standards, institutions, and ideals. The book under discussion today takes a more fine-grained look at the extraordinary ways in which the political and economic elite in Central Asia have become thoroughly globalized forces. In telling this story, Cooley and his co-author explain in clear-headed language the massive imbalance that has emerged in Central Asian societies. The robust networks of Central Asian autocrats stand in stark contrast to what the authors describe as their country's weak, demonized, and underfunded civil societies. Of course, the kleptocrats so fiercely target their own civil society and independent journalists because the corrupt elite understand the role that such independent institutions play in keeping corruption in check. But as Larry Diamond has observed, because the principal logic of kleptocratic governance is to steal, corruption is not a bug in the system, it is the system. In such societies, impunity is the standard, and corruption cannot be kept in check. In a globalized world with internationalist kleptocrats, the impact and influence of this corrosive governance is felt well beyond the borders of Central Asia. It has become readily apparent that this profoundly complex challenge does not lend itself to simple or easy responses. To make headway in the understanding and to arrive at a more effective set of responses, Cooley and Heathershaw write that, quote, more collaboration across the boundaries of journalism, academic and policy research will be required. Finally, we need to reckon with the reality that as well-resourced authoritarian regimes have become more internationalist, they exert greater influence on democracies and democratic institutions, and we need to pay greater attention to the national security implications from the corrosive money that flows so seamlessly across borders in this new environment. So it's I think, a very important book. I'm commending it to everyone here. I'm really delighted that we have two expert commentators who know the region and these issues exceptionally well, who will speak after Alex makes his presentation. We have, to my far left, Marlene Laruelle, who's Director of Central Asia Program and Associate Director and Research Professor at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the George Washington University. And to my immediate left is my colleague Miriam Lanskoy, who's a Senior Director for Russia and Eurasia programs here at the National Endowment for Democracy. Just say a word about our social media for today's discussion. For those of you who are on Twitter, you can follow this discussion and contribute to the conversation by following the International Forum for Democratic Studies at Think Democracy, and you can follow NED at NED Democracy. I'd also like to take a moment to express my thanks to the International Forum staff who helped organize today's event. And I mentioned earlier that copies of the book will be for sale at the back of the room. And finally, and importantly, please join me in silencing your cell phones before we start. We'll hear first from Alex, who's going to use a PowerPoint, so we'll leave the stage while he's doing that. And then we'll hear from Marlene and Miriam, and then we'll have time for Q&A. Alex. Yeah.
Chris, thanks very much. It's a real pleasure. It's a real honor to be here at the NED for what is essentially the Washington, D.C., U.S. book launch of Dictators Without Borders. Just a couple of words on how the book came out. One is that it actually arose directly from my previous book called Great Games, Local Rules, and John Heathershaw was reviewing it for Chatham House's International Affairs. And he spent a lot of time on the corruption chapter, which I guess he really liked, but he also was, I think, very constructively critical of it, and it initiated just an excellent discussion between us that then blossomed into a book about the transnational aspects of Central Asia. And that leads me to my second point, that yes, this is a book about power and money in and out of Central Asia. And I think that's key. It's not in the subtitle, but it's really a book about the West, right? In terms of Western institutions, Western practices, Western brokers, Western gatekeepers that enable some of these dynamics, these extraterritorial authoritarian dynamics to go on outside of the region. Finally, really grateful to Marlene and Miriam for not only being here, but all the really excellent work that they do on the region at their respective institutions too. So let's get at it with what I call the three myths of Central Asian politics that are out there. And these are myths that are very strong both in academia and also in the policy setting. We call these the myth of global isolation and lack of connectivity, the myth of partial or incomplete liberalization reform, and the myth of local traditionalism. And we argue these three myths, some weaker than others, but pervade our understanding of Central Asian politics. They actually inform our diagnosis of the developmental ills of the region. And in part, the book is a response to trying to debunk them. The password's connectivity. For the last, I don't know, at least 5 years, possibly 7 and 8, we hear that the main problem in Central Asia, especially as a developmental problem, is the region's lack of connectivity. If only Central Asia were connected to the world, to global markets, to global financial institutions, to global norms, to global practices, then somehow this would be a blueprint for its development. And so much of both the US agenda with the New Silk Route and the Chinese agenda with the Belt and Road is positing that this connectivity, which is usually thought of in terms of infrastructure, right, is going to provide the blueprint for Central Asian development. In some ways, connectivity is needed. This is sort of an updated slide from the previous book that shows just how high informal barriers to trade are in Central Asia compared to the rest of the world, right? And how they haven't actually improved that much throughout the 2000s. So you see Central Asian, the red times of import, 79 days, the gray one's 67. But compared to the rest of the world, Central Asia's informal barriers to trade, its regional connectivity are indeed problematic. But if we look at some other measures, this connectivity statistic that we see here is quite selective. For example, let's take Chinese trading and Russian trading with the region. In 2001, Chinese trade was $1 billion. This is 2001, not 1991. 2001 is $1 billion. By the end of the decade, shot up to 30. Probably the figures are more in the 50 range when you consider Central Asian customs services underreport trade statistics. So even though there's these internal barriers, the region is certainly expanding trade with external actors, and we could throw the EU into this mix. We could talk about Central Asia as a global leader in remittance dependence, actually number 1 and number 2 by most surveys, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan as a proportion of GDP. We could talk about capital flight. In Tajikistan, according to the IMF, it was 65% of GDP This is an incredible statistic, right? I mean, when you think about the Russian virtual economy in the 1990s, this figure was estimated to be more 10, 12 range. We could talk about the use of certain financial institutions as hub in global money laundering. So the allegations of money laundering that were leveled against Asia Universal Bank. So according to Kyrgyz prosecutors, AUB hosted transactions of over about $1 trillion in the form of shell companies. So Central Asia's development challenge then, is it lack of connectivity, or is rather what the ill here, too much kleptocracy and capital flight, right? Is it the wrong types of connectivity that are getting in the way of the region? And that, I think, is one of the sort of central analytics here. It's not global isolation. It's ties that we normally don't look at as being quite significant and consequential. What about the myth of partial liberalization? What about this idea that Central Asia hasn't reformed? It hasn't globalized. Again, it depends on what you look at. Certainly in a place like in Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, you still have capital controls, you have currency controls, right? And that is one area where there is reform needed and liberalization needed. But we argue in the book that all of the Central Asian countries extensively use offshore companies and shell corporations, this legal globalization, and are heavily dependent on it for international transactions. So what do offshore vehicles do as shell companies? They minimize tax liability, personal and corporate, that's how we know them. They facilitate capital flight and money laundering. They conceal the origins of investments, right? Chinese firms use BVI registered entities. That comes up as BVI FDI as opposed to Chinese BVI. They provide official actors plausible deniability about illegal transactions. Even though we have rules against anonymous shell companies, in practice, as another co-author of mine, Jason Sharman, has pointed out in a lot of his work, they're not followed in practice. I want to illustrate this by just giving some simple FDI statistics from Kazakhstan in 2012, the top 5 origins destinations of direct investment. And these are provided by the Kazakh Central Bank, which is the only central bank for this year that provides sort of stats. That's why I take them. But if we were to look at this, we see that the Netherlands is responsible for 42% of inward direct investment and 58% of outward direct investment. You might think, wow, what are the Dutch investing in Kazakhstan? But of course, this isn't necessarily the Dutch. These are entities that have incorporated in the Netherlands, right? That are using the Netherlands as a jurisdiction. Also, I would point out the BVI is also there in that particular list. So part of the problem that we face as researchers is that when we just rely on countries of origins, we actually don't know which entity is behind that particular sort of registration, right? Give you an example. Talco, the Tajik aluminum company responsible for over half of Tajikistan's exports. 2004, 2008, litigation occurring in UK courts over ownership, accusations of embezzlement, and management structures, an estimated $150 to $200 million paid in legal fees, mostly by the Tajik government. The case was settled, but what came out of the settlement was an enormously complex set of offshore tolling arrangements that involved Talco, its management company that was based in the British Virgin Islands, suppliers of alumina like Norsk Hydro, banks, and financial entities spanning the world. This was truly a web of offshore arrangements. The final myth that we address is the myth of local tradition. In political science, especially in the 1990s, we had a big debate, in political science anyway, about the role of clans. Are clans important in Central Asian politics, informal politics? How important? How do we know? Our argument here is that whatever the merits of these affiliations and informal affiliations, a lot of Central Asian elites should be viewed as global players, global citizens, that in fact, by spending too much time on the local, we ignore their global dimension, their global activities. What we found in the books is that Central Asian elites tend to acquire residency in multiple countries. How do they do that? 3 mechanisms. First, they serve in the diplomatic corps, which afford them the possibility with diplomatic passports to live overseas. They actually just purchase citizenship and passports. St. Kitts and Nevis, for example, is one source for Central Asian second citizenship. Or they apply for political asylum, right? They use the asylum laws of countries in the West, places like Australia or Canada or the United States or Switzerland. And in many cases, because these countries are authoritarian, courts grant them that political asylum, so they acquire residency that way. So already you see this twist, how Central Asian elites and disaffected elites use the institutions of the West to protect themselves, right, from Central Asian governments later down the road. But you can also just buy citizenship. This came up earlier in a seminar that we had, but this is one particular corporation that's pitching its citizenship services to Kazakh clients. Just to give you a sense of this, these are data from the initial Tier 1 visa investor program that the UK put out there. Out of 1,600 residence permits, right, that were granted in exchange, 5-year residence permits in exchange for investments of £1 million. Russia and China were top of the list, about 400 each, about 25%. But look at Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan's actually number 6, 41 Kazakhs were granted UK citizenship, or rather residency, to then become eligible for citizenship later in the program. So most people here will recognize that Central Asia is trending authoritarian, with the exception of Kyrgyzstan, whose politics remain unconsolidated but volatile. And these are the sort of Freedom House Eurasian democracy scores that show a kind of general sort of decline in the region. See Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Russia, Tajikistan. I'm actually not going to discuss so much the scores, but I want to bring a different perspective that gets at the book's arguments, which is kind of 3 arguments, big sort of framing arguments for the book. One is, as domestic political space tightens, as we get these authoritarian trends, Central Asian political, economic, and legal contestation takes place outside of the region, right? So if political contestation can't take place within the region because space is so tight, it takes place outside of the region, right? In courtrooms, in arbitration hearings, in requests for political extradition, in battles over sort of opposition media, and so forth. Second main argument is that the pursuit of exiles, political exiles abroad, and the recovery of overseas assets becomes an unstated foreign policy priority and goal for many of the Central Asian countries, right? You won't find this on the official sort of statement what the foreign policy priorities are, but these kinds of extraterritorial dynamics become embroiled in foreign policy making. And then the final point that we make, a general one, is to generally contrast, as Chris was saying before, the general state of Central Asia's transnational civil societies, which tend to be weak, underfunded, politically illegitimate in some cases, with the more robust transnational networks that elites themselves are finding themselves in and actively building networks that make extensions into not only places of residence, but also connections between international organizations and regional organizations, and so forth. So this contrast between elites and Central Asian society is sort of the third kind of point about the book. So what are some of the mechanisms then that we see this political contestation above? First, we see a lot of chasing down of political opponents and exiles on accusations of money laundering, right? Using anti-money laundering to go after people like former mayor of Almaty, Viktor Krapunov there on the slide, and the use of Interpol red notices to flag them for AML. So this is quite a common sort of tactic. But perhaps we should ask, who's an exile? Who's an exile? And this is a very heterogeneous category. What we found are sort of 4 main strands: former regime insiders and family members, 2 members of opposition political parties and movements that are banned, banned clerics and alleged religious extremists, including alleged members of prescribed terrorist groups, and then the 4th category, independent journalists, academics, and civil society activists. Here's two high-profile examples. One is the former Kazakh Prime Minister, Mr. Kazakh, residence in London. The other one, son of former Kyrgyz President Maxim Bakiev, currently in residence in Surrey, UK. We present a kind of a theory of extraterritorial authoritarian politics, or a model, sort of the different stages in which Central Asian governments and security services go through, from putting certain political opponents on notice, issuing Interpol red notices when they're abroad, to arresting and detaining them, or encouraging foreign countries to do so, to the extradition and the endgame, which plays out in different ways that I'll get to in a second. One of the products of the origins of this book also is what we're labeling the Central Asian Political Exile Database, which is being run by graduate students and my co-author, John Heathershaw, out of the University of Exeter. It was initiated in 2014, founded in November 2016. It's been through 2 editions, now 160 members, and one of the conclusions that what we found is the widespread and increasing use of extraterritorial security measures by all the Central Asian states, but with more cases from Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and there's an important reason for that, mostly to do with sort of migration of migrant communities. But that's the breakdown over there. But if you go to the website and play around with it, you can sort of have a look at the information there and the trajectories of some of these exiles. It's all public information. So I want to talk about some of these then themes, these arguments, how they play out in 3 of the chapters of the book. The first is this kind of case of inside-out, outside-in politics, the case of Mukhtar Ablyazov, or what I call Kazakhstan's most wanted, right? Ablyazov is a remarkable case for researchers, right? Because the 2 narratives about him could not be more different, right? Ablyazov himself claims that he is a pro-democracy dissident and advocate, that he was politically estranged from Nazarbayev, that his holdings and companies were politically motivated and they were illegally expropriated by the Kazakh government, and therefore he fled and went in exile, where he continued to be a champion for Kazakh democratic causes. The Kazakh government sees this very differently. They view Ablyazov as a criminal who has allegedly embezzled billions of pounds, and dollars, rather. I'll get to the pounds in a minute. He's at the center of the massive BTA bank fraud and allegations of money laundering. He was found in contempt by UK High Court, also for failure to disclose his assets in a series of judgments made by the High Court there. And while in exile, he's accused of having supported opposition, media, illegal party organizations, and even having orchestrated the crackdown in Zhanaozen. What's fascinating about Ablyazov is this sort of, let's take the 2 aspects of this. On the one hand, BTA and his bank, we know through a lot of arbitration hearings and court transcripts that Ablyazov camouflaged and admitted to camouflage, hid a lot of his assets through a series of offshore shell companies. And sort of this is one particular sort of scheme that you have here, where it's just layers and layers. One UK High Court found over sort of 600 shell companies sort of associated with his holdings and so forth. And all of this, as he admits, in an effort to sort of camouflage his holdings so they wouldn't be expropriated by Kazakh regulators. Kazakh government again. This is a statement by Foreign Minister Idrisov on Ablyazov, right, who's kind of rejecting the whole premise of this guy being a political dissident and of sort of the founding of also the newspaper, support of the newspaper Respublika, and his political ally, Ms. Kozlov, who says, we classified the situation around Mr. Ablyazov and the structures involved as a special campaign orchestrated by Mr. Ablyazov against Kazakhstan. Therefore, Kazakhstan does have the right to defend itself against this campaign. What's interesting is that there becomes this web of Ablyazov associates that are all wanted in connection to the case in Ablyazov, and this extends to people like his security guard, who is picked up in Spain, his accountant in the Czech Republic, an associate also in Poland, and his family members who are in Italy. The Italian case is quite interesting because they are, in May 2013, they are abducted and forcibly put on a flight by Italian security services, where they go back to Kazakhstan. UN Human Rights Council weighs in, says that this is an extraordinary rendition, right? So Italy joins the US, China, and Russia as countries who have carried out extraordinary renditions in Central Asia. There's a massive political scandal in Italy over this. It's denounced by the president. The government almost comes down as a result. One other sort of coda to this, just in December, France's, actually after he was found in contempt, Ablyasov fled to France, where he was picked up in the south of France in 2013, and he was scheduled for extradition. But the High Court on December 9th annuls the extradition decree on the grounds of avoiding complicity in prosecution for political purpose. That was sort of the final word in that one. So what the interesting pattern here is that every time you get this interaction between Ablyasov and his associates with the higher court in these European cases, the question of political motivation seems to come up, and these extraditions seem to be overturned. Case 2, let's look at the fate of Tajikistan's exiles, also a chapter in the book. Here, we're looking at documented patterns of political exiles, mostly living in two regions, in Russia and in Turkey. The black dot refers to someone who we've coded as having disappeared. The white dot, someone who's been involved in a rendition back to Tajikistan. And the black square, an attack or an assassination carried out overseas. Umurali Kuvatov sort of provides an example of these types of exile and global dynamics. After fleeing Tajikistan in summer 2012, falling out with the regime, he is then spends time in Moscow, in Dubai, in Bishkek, before settling down in Istanbul, where he registers with the UNHCR, and he is actually killed, shot in Istanbul in March 2015, and he was head of the opposition group 24 movement, which was also declared extremist and banned in October 2014. Case 3, this has been in the news. This is our Uzbek chapter of Gulnara Karimova, daughter of the late President Islam Karimova. She was implicated in a series of telecom scandals and related investigations. She was subject to money laundering probes in the US and Switzerland, France, and Sweden. Following international investigations, was recalled and placed under house arrest in Tashkent, where before she went offline, she was appealing to Western media as a human rights defender. Again, what's interesting and what we know from, there we go. What we know about this deal with TeliaSonera and some of the other telecoms was that it was structured over a long period of time and involved the use of a shell company, Takilant, that would sell the rights to telecommunications licenses to foreign companies coming in. The director of the company was a Gulnara associate that was then tied to members of the Karimov family. A Dutch prosecutor recently confirmed that Takilant is beneficially owned by Gulnara Karimova herself. And then, actually, the TeliaSonera case is part of a series of other telecom companies, MTS, Vimpelcon, all, again, who have been investigated, and there's been different sort of cases in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in the US, and Switzerland, and so forth. One of the interesting things that emerges out of this case is that assets concerning the case are frozen, about $850 million that are connected to the Bank of New York Mellon. And so the question with these frozen assets, what should happen to them? Right? What should we do with $850 million? Right? The Uzbek government wants it back. Right? They say these are the proceeds of corrupt acts. Right? They should be returned to the people of Uzbekistan. But it's not clear for what purpose and what can be the agreement. And this is quite an area of sort of new law. Do you set up a charitable fund, right, akin to the Bota Foundation in Kazakhstan? Do you give rebates to consumers in Uzbekistan that have been damaged by this? Or do you set up accounts for things like arms purchases? Right, there's sort of an op-ed on this here. It's all up in the air, but it's now in a bilateral between US and Uzbek governments. The point here I would make is that For us, we have us here in the U.S., we keep sort of the DOJ part, the criminal justice part, and the State Department kind of foreign policy part separate. But I think in this particular case, for Uzbekistan, this is the pressing issue in relations with the U.S. Final point to make then is how do we understand these different transnational networks, civil and uncivil society? One thing that we know from the books is that Central Asian elites have bought up a lot of Western real estate, where they reside in places like Beverly Hills or Sunny Hill Park, both through sort of LLCs, both documented in the press. And who owns 221B Baker Street? Actually, according to Global Witness, it was part of a property empire that was linked to the late Rahat Aliyev, President Nazarbayev's former son-in-law turned political opponent. So let me get to some conclusions here. We want this to be the start of a conversation, right? We think it's important to sort of just get out on the table that the assumption that Central Asia is globally isolated is just flat out wrong. We don't even think it's debatable, right, theoretically and empirically. After 25 years, Central Asia and Central Asian elites are highly, yet selectively globalized. Yes, Central Asia could be more globalized in other ways, but we haven't done enough work on the types of globalization there. Central Asian authoritarianism and opposition is increasingly implicated in global and transnational networks, institutions, and social circles. So what does this mean for policy? First, our traditional notion of democracy and governance work needs to be expanded to include these transnational elements, right? Civil society needs to be trained in tactics not only regarding sort of networking and the rule of law, but also how to cope with AML procedures, Interpol abuse, the use of extraterritorial legal treaties on a regional level. We need to get our own house in order. Having a discussion here in the Kleptocracy Initiative, how do we promote individual transparency? Our company registries that don't list beneficial owners as they should, our real estate practices, which are completely lax in terms of the due diligence obligations. And then finally, one other recommendation that we have is that companies doing business in the region that are publicly traded should make, if they have not done so already, they should make their due diligence reports, their assessments publicly available so that we can also see the process and the reasoning by which a lot of these deals and investments were made. So that's my opening summary, and I very much look forward to Miriam and Marlene's comments and to your questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for just a fascinating presentation, a lot of food for thought. And why don't we turn now right to Marlene.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to give some comments to this great book. I must say I was reading the book before getting the invitation, and as a scholar on Central Asia, I should say the kind of book that all of us would have dreamed written, but we didn't. It's Alex and John who did it, and that's really a remarkable book. Alex, your previous book on global great games and local rules is already a classic for Central Asian studies, but I really think this one will be even more a kind of milestone for the research on Central Asia and how it is connected to the most updated, advanced analytical tool we may have to look at the international world and as everything related to transnational issues. I also found that the use of court documents and investigative journalism in order to make a demonstration of political science is really impressive. And that's really something for political scientists. I think there are really things to learn from that. And of course, the policy implication of this research, they are huge, they are very provocative. I think that will have long-term repercussion on the way we look at the region, and as you said, I hope also on the way we look at the West. So there are three elements that the book brings to our knowledge on Central Asia that I would like to mention here. The first one is that political authoritarianism is connected to a specific economic policy and to some financial mechanism. So authoritarianism is a money machine mechanism, and it's a way of doing business. It may seem very obvious when you just say it like that authoritarianism, it's also a business. But in fact, if you think twice, it has huge implication on the way the West wants to influence this regime, because traditionally, Western advocacy has been interpreting authoritarianism only under its political aspect and not with its economic aspect, which means that if really we want to look at authoritarianism as a business, then we need to change the tool of Western advocacy toward these kind of regimes. The second element is that authoritarian regimes, as you said, are not isolated. They are very well connected in integrating, which of course opened the floor to a very kind of deep and challenging discussion about what the world order and the kind of global international system is really, and the role of the West in sustaining these Central Asian regimes. So we have this kind of contradiction of fighting against them and at the same time giving them the opportunity to sustain themselves. And the third conclusion is that authoritarianism is usually considered as a political science category, but it's really very much interlinked to a bigger trend, a more sociological, society-related trend, which is that of illiberalism. And I use illiberalism in a very kind of broad definition as a trend trying to kind of securitize identities and values and trying to question the notion of progress or enlightenment. And that I really found fascinating in the book, it's how it resonates with trends that we see at the societal level, which really means that these regimes are not disconnected from their society. They are very much following trends that have deeper roots in the society in terms of illiberalism, and I will be mentioning just a few of them very rapidly. We see the rise of ethno-nationalism among younger generation very clearly, especially in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. We see vigilantism emerging, especially in Kyrgyzstan, with youth groups that patrol the streets, promoting what they consider as law and order against all their enemies, women who would be too liberated, LGTB groups, migrants, expatriates, and so on. We see both at the societal and at the state level permanent references to something called national mentality, identity, to the quest of authenticity, preservation of traditional values. All this vocabulary is very much there in the society and at the state level, and you can see how it is also used by the Central Asian state in their foreign policy strategy. We see the rise of Islamic values and practices which are not illiberal by themselves, but we see that the way they are spreading in Central Asian society is mostly around gender segregation and discussion about which kind of female clothes are appropriate or not, so a very kind of conservative trend. And then we see globally in the society, and here also both at the society and at the state level, the rise of this kind of anti-Western narrative. And in fact, it's an anti-liberal more than an anti-Western narrative, saying that the US has been acting openly against Islam, that democracy is an illusion, that the Western agenda is always imposed on Central Asian societies, that foreign aid and foreign investors are never coming for good reasons, but always with hidden goals. And so what this Central Asian state have been bringing is really to kind of show that the liberal values have been disempowering Central Asian society, and the way to re-empower Central Asian societies is to come up with an illiberal agenda. And I think that's very much related to many aspects that we see after in terms of the Central Asian state and the Central Asian elites' techniques of power. So the book has really this incredible wide dimension because it's not only about political regime and their financial mechanism. It really shows us the embeddedness of the Central Asian regimes in their own societies by many aspects, which of course mean that we have to rethink what means legitimacy in the Central Asian context. Because you don't need only repression to be legitimate. You need to be agenda setters. And the Central Asian state and their elites have been incredibly skilled in being the agenda setter ideologically in terms of identity and values, which of course has also here implication in terms of Western policy and advocacy. Because if the West has failed, or more or less failed, or has been disappointed in the influence it could have in Central Asia, it's not only because of the Central Asian state and societies. It's because these elites have been able to negotiate with their societies something in terms of value agenda that is very difficult for Western actors to fight against. The last element I wanted to mention is that the book is really showing us how Central Asian regimes can function because the international system allows their political and financial mechanism to perform very well in the system as it is. Which is this kind of, and I think that's probably one of the most impressive conclusions of the book, that the Central Asian regime on many aspects are a product of the West. Okay? And this kind of conclusion are huge because usually Western policy toward the region is always formulated as how do we want to influence them, not how we get influenced, and how they use tools that we are also producing in order to maintain themselves in power. And if we don't try to integrate this element into our own policy decision making, there is no chance to try to be more influential than what we have been so far. So in a sense, we have been projecting a kind of ideal, archetypal West to the region, and in return, we got the region sending us back another vision of the West, which is also another West, but it's the West we don't want to see, the West that is living parallel to us and that we don't want to recognize. So it's a kind of mirror game. And in a sense, I think, and that was the conclusion I was making to myself in reading the book, the West is schizophrenic because there are several Wests, but we are always projecting only one West toward the region, and the region is sending back another West, saying these Central Asian elites, as you said, are very well Westernized and globalized, not just with the West we would like to project over them. And I think that the same conclusion in terms of this rise of illiberal values and securitization element that you had both at the state elites level and in the societies. Illiberalism is also part of the Western political heritage, and so in a sense, illiberalism is not an anti-Western policy or ideology. It's just a policy or an ideology of the other West, the West that we don't want to see, but which is rising everywhere, including in the US and Europe. So I think if you put all these dimensions together, you really can see how much the book will bring both to our knowledge on Central Asia, but also globally to the way we need to rethink the West and the Central Asian interaction, and that works globally for many other regions in the world, and how much work has to be done in terms of policy reframing in the term of all the Western tools towards Central Asia, I think needs to be deeply reshaped, and the book will probably have a huge both academic and policy influence on that. So I will stop, and congratulations again.
So thanks for those remarks. I think after Miriam speaks, it would be good to have Alex talk a little bit about the skillfulness of the regimes that control all of the information infrastructure in those countries and all of the essentially space for political pluralism in defining kind of the illiberal standards that are there, and how this has played out. I think you've made this argument in other settings about the way in which civilizational values and traditional values have been arrogated by authoritarian regimes, and it's interesting to hear it in this context as well. Let's hear from Miriam Lanskoy now.
So thank you very much for this opportunity. I enjoyed the book immensely, even though what it covers is so terrible. But at the same time, it's a great opportunity to wrestle with a lot of complicated moral questions. It's full of villains who extort money, they kill their opponents, they use every means at their disposal to hold on to ill-gotten gains and maintain their place in power. But it also, it's a wonderful contemporary history of Central Asia. It covers the recent period and the major struggles of each country. And there are many times when I just felt like I was kind of swimming in and out of this, or some of our grantees and programs were kind of the next to the villains are some of the heroes who are also swimming in this pond, and you're taking all these different pieces and bringing them together. It's a ton of research that is very well organized. So it was just an opportunity for me to remember some of these people. So for instance, what the Uzbeks were able to do, which was to hunt down the refugees from the massacre in Andijan and use legal and illegal means of deportation to bring those people back. There were Russian activists, Lena Rybinina in particular, who were fighting that tooth and nail and were trying to use European court mechanisms. And it was for me great to find a passage of a few pages describing what that was like. And I don't know that it exists anywhere else. And that's just one example, but there were many instances like that where the kind of struggle of what all of this means in real life is described. There was an excellent chapter on Tajikistan and the recent crackdown there. And I thought, so few people have talked about what's happened in Tajikistan in this very unfair labeling of Kabiri as who's a moderate politician who ran the major opposition party and kept it away from Islamic extremism for 20 years and has now been driven out of the country, and people around him have gone to jail and so forth. And it's just absolute terrible crackdown. This is probably one of the best accounts that we have of that. So it's just really a very strong history of what has happened in Central Asia over recent years. But it also ultimately, for me, is a book about moral hazard, because in each of the cases that you explore, it's not just the Central Asians, and it's not even just the tax havens, but it's usually major OECD countries. It's companies just about everywhere. The asset recovery that's going on now with Uzbekistan, and Alex had a slide up about the case involving Gulnara Karimova that's going on in 10 different jurisdictions. It's being led by the United States, the Department of Justice, but it's cooperating, Luxembourg, Amsterdam, Netherlands, UK, Ireland, So we can't say that this is something that is just going on in a few jurisdictions. This is a truly global problem. And it constantly forces us to ask ourselves whether, and I'm not sure what the answer is. It would be great to get Alex to comment on this. And I think there are passages in the book that read in different directions of do we need better regulation? Do we need better enforcement? How serious are all these problems? Is it a matter of raising awareness throughout the democracies, throughout the OECD states, and making a few tweaks, or is it something much more cynical and fundamental that's going on? So I'm going to make a couple of other points. First, the sort of what is this about in the end? And the book does a wonderful job of connecting the kleptocracy, the corruption, to human rights abuses of all kinds, and especially extraterritorial ones. So the ability to hunt down a political opponent, pretty much anywhere, is expressed clearly with a lot of very specific case studies. But the maybe fundamental issue is even bigger than that. It's and I'm going to quote Navalny, who 3 days ago had this major protest that he inspired in Russia, and he put up a blog that day that basically said corruption equals poverty, and he just with an equal sign there. And what he was trying to say to people is that the reason, if you had better government and better governance, you would not be poor, you would not be suffering the economic crisis that the Russians are suffering now. And for Central Asia, that goes, triply. Do Central Asians have to be as poor as they are? This is a desperately poor region. I looked up infant mortality statistics, and the best one was Kazakhstan with 26 deaths per 1,000, and the worst was Tajikistan with 54. For Europe, it's 4. For Moldova, it's 11. Moldova is a very poor European country. So you have malnutrition, infant mortality, sort of the kinds of, I looked up statistics for, stunted growth and just low birth weight, kind of poor nutrition, vitamin deficiency before age 5. In those kinds of categories, Central Asia is doing miserably. It's sort of, then you have forced labor. So imagine undernourished children in the cotton fields. That's kind of what poverty is for Central Asia. And then billions of dollars that are going from this region, which is, by the way, resource rich, into the first world. And that's ultimately the problem that we're looking at. And then switching just to some of the more specific pieces, I wanted to say something about Turkmenistan. You had chapters on each of the others and somewhat less on Turkmenistan. You mentioned the Global Witness report with an $8 billion account in Deutsche Bank. Turkmenistan might cut against a little bit the other case studies because it is so isolated. And it sort of poses another interesting question. You have the enablers and you have the financial institutions that are enabling this kind of behavior in the other four, but isolated Turkmenistan that sells its gas, I think now exclusively to China. Is it better off for not having the Western influence? Not really. But there's a good report, I just want to mention it, done by Crude Accountability on Turkmenistan, which basically says that the oil gas sector is entirely controlled by the president, and 80% of the proceeds go to the president. So the state budget, and this is one of the poorest countries in the world, the state budget gets 20%. So I'm going to use that to segue to Kazakhstan, which is that Ablyazov, who, and I thought this was the most interesting chapter because, again, it's just full of these unbelievable moral dilemmas and complications. Ablyazov, who's this oligarch let's call him that, in Kazakhstan, is forced to flee. He goes abroad, and he sets up a satellite station called K+. And I can tell you at the time how excited Central Asian Democrats, dissidents were about that. That it's our Al Jazeera. Finally, somebody's doing it. There's going to be an opposition satellite station. And actually, one of our Turkmens, who was a Reagan Fasalov fellow here at one point, Farid, he had a show out of Europe on K+ that actually broadcast into Turkmenistan. His family was threatened. He had to go into police protection. I think he was in Austria. This is like 10 years ago. So even Turkmenistan had that kind of reach. Eventually, K+ was blocked and taken off. But here's Ablyazov, who he's a complicated figure. I mean, it depends. How do you view Mikhail Khodorkovsky in Russia? How do you view Sanjar Umarov in Uzbekistan? These are figures, these are elite, wealthy oligarchs who go into opposition. And they fund the opposition, and guess what happens? It suddenly turns out that they've engaged in some kind of behavior, and then they quickly go to jail. And Ablyazov goes to jail. He comes out of jail. And he had, I should also say, he formed a opposition political party, Democratic Choice of Kazakhstan. And a lot of people that we know and respect in Kazakhstan ran on the Democratic Choice of Kazakhstan ticket. So when Kazakhstan, and he eventually goes into opposition, goes abroad, and you find these embezzlement cases, he was funding, or it is believed that he was funding, opposition newspapers, just a whole array of projects that people found very valuable. And there's a sort of cleansing experience of jail in these instances, where when you view Khodorkovsky in a completely different light, or civil society people do, than they did when he was, at the top of kind of his career in the 90s or so forth. and there's also something to be said about, so in Ablyazov's family was essentially kidnapped in Italy or France? In Italy, and sent back to Kazakhstan. They were legally there. It was an amazing case. He spent 3 years in detention before the extradition to Kazakhstan was stopped. His assets were seized. If law can't apply evenly in all cases, what does the selective application of the law in those instances where the person is a regime critic and is a political opponent of the regime mean? Because it looks terribly cynical if one assumes that this is a difficulty of doing research, the things that become public, you never have a complete data set. But if you assume that the cases that we know about represent a wide range of government officials and top figures, the ones that get prosecuted are the ones who go against the regime. Let me say quickly about the case in Uzbekistan. This is one of the biggest cases ever in forfeiture or Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. 800 million recovered so far, 800 million more sought. This is an ongoing case with the Kleptocracy Initiative, which is part of our Department of Justice. And it's kind of up in the air in terms of where it will go next, I guess. I had not realized that arms sales is one of the possible uses of those funds. That Karimov has passed away creates an opportunity for negotiation. This is one of the biggest issues. There was an appeal signed against Sanjar Omarov, but Umid and Yazova, many Uzbek civil society organizations that kind of got together and wrote a joint statement supporting what the Justice Department is doing, but also saying that this money cannot go into some kind of government project, that it should go to benefit Uzbek society. First of all, victims of torture should support infrastructure, social projects, health, education, that kind of thing, and authentic anti-corruption work. And again, that case goes to 8 or 10 jurisdictions. It's not just about shell companies. So I'm going to kind of maybe end there. I've said already the big questions of moral hazard and where we go from here in terms of thinking through the different things that need to happen to help this along.
I want to hear from the audience, so I'm just going to just take up just one point that Miriam, and thank you both for that made, I think is really important, that these are really difficult moral issues. I mean, in part, this is what attracted us to do this book, right? That this is, despite the sort of clarity maybe of the title, these are tough issues because a lot of them are contextual and they involve a lot of different actors, a lot of different practices, norms, counter norms. But at the same time, when you start looking at the West as being not just a sort of a source of institutions and values, but a space which you can operate in, I think to us it becomes a little clearer in that the globalization story we tell here is, rather than being absorbed by globalization, right? What the Central Asian governments figured out is how to selectively use the different institutions of globalization and reconfigure them, right, for their purposes. And I think that kind of burrowing in narrative allows us, and I think Miriam is absolutely right, like, I'm not sure we can come down on some of these issues. And your question, can it be tweaked or is it structural? I still struggle with that. And in some ways, that's why we don't come out with specific recommendations or a one-size-fits-all recommendation. I think we can have certain practices in certain industries, right, that sheds light on this. But I think the overall sort of picture is of figuring out these different sectors, these different sorts of areas in which these spaces are actually being used for different purposes than they were sort of intended to. And I think that's what makes kind of the ethical part of this, difficult in some ways to sort of grapple with, because you don't want to say all shell companies are bad, or they're always used for purposes, or all real estate is bad. That's not the point, but that's also what makes it, I think, tougher sort of on the policy front, though I do think we can take some important steps in all these areas.
So we can take questions from the audience, but I thought I would just ask you for a moment. You have a list of suggested responses
Yeah.
at the end of the book. Given Miriam's question, if you were to prioritize some of these things, given where we are, for example, you've noted when we've spoken that there's already been a lot of headway in the sense that attention has been focused on some of the problems that have emerged from the manipulation of institutions in the international space. And this is understood better, how real estate is being misused, so forth. So that's good. So awareness has been raised. In some respects, policymakers are looking at these things. But given how large the challenge is, and given how finite the resources and time are, people tackling it,
Sure.
what would you say are the things that should be moved toward the top of the list to address these challenges?
So I think the first rule is to stop pretending that some sort of large investment in infrastructure is going to solve these problems. It's not. It's going to make them worse, right? And that applies both on the U.S. side and the Chinese side, right? We have a chapter in the book called "The New Silk Route Bends Offshore," right? And it's there to sort of show how this sort of, because we don't want to deal with governance and democracy, we pour a lot of our energies into sort of, these sort of, infrastructure projects without thinking about, well, is this going to be accompanied by breaking up monopolies in railways and in trains? Are you going to demand sort of transparency of sort of contracts and sort of transit fees? So I think in some ways, because we don't want to talk about these issues, Chris, we're going more and more, we're pouring energies more and more in areas where these problems aren't going to be addressed. They're going to be made even worse. So I think part of what we need to do is confront it head on now, right? Because by adding sort of layers of resources to it, it's not going to get better. And in fact, the scandals are just going to percolate. We've had scandals here, scandals in Beijing over CNPC and what they did in Central Asia, right? Essentially, with sort of subsidiaries in the region, without a monitoring Ministry of Energy. And basically we know now that a lot of these figures pretty much reached their arrangements without a lot of sort of central oversight at all. So I think that's sort of step one, sort of back away and sort of realize the kind of the do no harm principle. Specifically on the other parts, I think a really good idea is to compile the sort of, a centralized registry of real estate acquisitions, right? And the sort of LLCs that they have. We've done a lot of this sort of in the book and in sort of a table. But I think this is one area in which the laws as we have them now, we have a legal framework on the books here in the US anyways, but it's not enforced. Right, and that is, all cash transactions need to be identified above a certain threshold in places sort of Manhattan and Miami. That hasn't been the case before. So I think we can do that ourselves. I think the other part of this is that in terms of sort of the influence aspect of this, right? Again, we need to sort of show that even though we have sort of FARA registrations on lobbyists, right? If you do work on behalf of a foreign government, you need to go in there. There are loopholes in that because there are ways of having influence at universities, for instance, right? Or as think tanks or in other sort of capacities where you don't have those same disclosure requirements. So I think in terms of what we can do, there's a whole set of issues where we have special exemptions and categories and you disclose here, but in not this case. And I think taking, sort of Larry suggested this earlier, taking stock, taking inventory of this full array of sort of influence sites and sort of, in places where it needs to be an enforcement issue, enforcing, in others where it's a standards issue, bringing them more into line with sort of transparency and disclosure. But I think a lot of this has to start at home. I mean, I think that's the number one thing. And then just very finally, I mean, I think right now in the moment that we're in, the transnational piece for me, and okay, I'm obsessed by this, I see the world this way now, but I think that has to be part of the conversations on DNG. I don't see how we can credibly go to sort of human rights activists, right, and sort of, start lecturing, right, or sort of lecturing about sort of, kleptocracy or the intermingling of sort of, business and sort of national ties without being humble about it, right? And in some cases, I think what this has done is remove the kind of whataboutism that was sort of there. Well, in the U.S., you're such hypocrites, right? You do this too. I love Marlene's sort of idea of the dual West, right? Putting one face when it's really another sort of face that's allowed. But I think engaging the transnational element in terms of the outreach and actual regular DNG work, I think makes it more even, makes it more balanced, makes it sort of seem that we are involved in similar kinds of advocacy commitments. And I think that can also have, also a disarming effect and help to reconstitute trust in some of the networks. So it's a very lengthy answer, but I think, those kinds of interventions are the way to go.
So we have time for some questions. I would ask those who have them if they could identify themselves and also keep the questions to the point, if that's possible. So let's start here, and then we'll work our way across.
Mark Plattner from Journal of Democracy. Alex, I thought that was really a revelatory analysis, and I'm still trying to process it. If I understood correctly, part of what you said, it was that because the domestic space is so tight in these countries, politics or political contestation, I think you said, takes place outside, which means to say in the West. But what are the channels of that contestation? It seems like it's, on the one hand, it's courtrooms, arbitration panels. On the other, it's assassinations. So it's a kind of the Western legal framework versus a completely illegal framework. And I guess my question is this a situation that the Central Asian regimes are perfectly content with? They can pick and choose what they want to do. This is a stable situation unless we really change things? Or is it something that at least important elements in the Central Asian regimes don't like because it leaves them too dependent somehow on what's going on in the West and less control at home?
Yeah, I mean, I think I use the word, and we use the word political contestation quite deliberately, right? Because this might be democratic or not democratic in character, right? You might have sort of authoritarians going after previous authoritarians, right? I mean, I think, when you think about, the travail of someone like Maxim Bakiev, sort of protected by asylum laws, right, in the UK, Maxim's not a Democrat, right? I mean, sort of he fled, his regime collapsed after sort of popular protest, right? And yet there is political contestation over what he did, allegations of what happened to sort of, assets that he was sort of involved with, of controlling. So we use the term contestation very deliberately. The sites that this happens are, yes, on the one hand, public hearings and public courtrooms about extraditions and extradition procedures. I think that's the most sort of overt ones. But they also happen in arbitration hearings. They happen in hearings about assets that are controlled by elites, hearings about jurisdictions, right? Which investment treaty should apply? Where is this actual even legal space sort of located? So, I think that's, these are certain sites and spaces. the business about sort of security services, it goes, it's disturbing and it goes deep. One of my colleagues, a postdoc at Columbia, Ed Lemon, is working on authoritarian security cooperation, right? We're looking at sort of Tajikistan and Russia as his primary sort of case and the informal and formal cooperation that you have there. The other part of this, and Chris has done a lot of work on this in the regional context, is we have regional organizations forming new types of law, right, that empower regimes, or the GCC and the SCO, anti-terror treaties, for instance, do many of the similar things. They create common blacklists of political opponents. They allow for extraterritorial operations by each other's security services in one another's affairs. They actually lower the bar of sort of burden of proof. In some ways, these regional organizations shield these regimes and countries from more international, clear-cut, universal humanitarian obligations. So there's a lot, again, it's this patchwork mix. It's, I think the term you used once is muddying of the waters, right? That sort of happens that then allows you to apply law selectively, right? And a lot of this is behind the rule of law, or rule of law is sort of invoked, and sort of the process and so forth. So it's not something that it's all this sort of freelancing going on, but the terms themselves are really key and really important here.
So why don't we take two questions together here, and then we'll come back to this side, or do you want?
Yes, sir. My name is Kami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator, and my question is, if your research touched South Asia, like, as you know, Pakistani Prime Minister, when he was trapped, or he trapped himself, or he was trapped by Pakistani military about Panama leak, his accounts was there. The Central Asian ruler came to help him just to divert the attention of Pakistani people. And similarly, few years ago, I provided a list of General Musharraf's account all over the world. He has billions of dollars, and I provided that list to Bruce Riedel, who used to work for the CIA for 20 years, I guess. And he has a couple of accounts, I guess, in Central Asia as well. And related question with Miriam, you said the socio-economic indicator of Central Asia, it's not very different in Pakistan. So do you think that poverty motivate these corrupt people to steal more money, or it just, because people are not aware of these things that cause this much corruption? For example, about this Musharraf, he is saying that he was given this gift by Saudi princes about some of his foreign account. So I don't know if your research touched. So this is my question: that is there any relationship between Central Asian corrupt ruler and Paki thieves? Thanks.
So let's take another question, and then we'll get responses.
Eleanor Bachrach. I've did some work in Central Asia for the IMF in early days, and generally I've worked in the region. And I find myself thinking of Tolstoy, and are all these authoritarian countries happy and alike, or are they sad and all different? It sounds as if they're very much following the Russian model, whether it's inherited or not, and certainly these types of things exist in other parts, other authoritarian regimes, but I wonder if there's a special post-Soviet cast. Also, I might mention it hurts the West and things, the real people, like escalating real estate values, pricing out normal people.
So I think this, Miriam mentioned this, and I think it's really important to realize. So Russia used to be a safe space for Central Asian dissidents and exiles, right? And also, Rita Borga and Andrei Soldatov wrote about this too in their book, that it used to be the case that if you had fallen out and you were living in Russia, right, this could be a relatively sort of safe space for you. That changes in the early 2000s. The European Court of Human Rights used to be an actual avenue, and Russia would comply with some of the cases, right? It was in kind of strange kind of way. You could have a hearing in Russia in the way that you couldn't in the U.S. and China when you talked about certain of the cases of sort of illegal renditions to these places. Now, of course, that's come to an end. So I think there's a dynamism here. I don't want to portray the space as, enduring or only informed by one norm or one set of practice. I mean, things have been deteriorating in the region. I would be curious to hear sort of Miriam's reaction to this. But it strikes me as, that redefinition of what's sort of safe and what's not happened in the mid-2000s, also because of geopolitical interests, where Russia wanted to start currying favor with the Central Asian regimes and essentially made itself an ally, and then either did things bilaterally or invoked Minsk or invoked sort of the SCO treaty or whatever. But that, to your point, no, I don't have anything about Pakistan. I would just say one of the reasons we're having this discussion, though, is that we're seeing that these things are global issues, right? The Panama Papers, why is this such a big thing globally? Because everyone can sort of type in and see who's implicated, right? From Iceland to Pakistan, right? And I think, again, one of the moments that we're in is that I think we're trending towards a global study of kleptocracy and the kinds of practices and the kind of institutions that facilitate kleptocracy. And what's important about the Panama Papers to me isn't sort of the offshore jurisdiction, sure. I mean, sort of, by definition there, and yes, many of them also involve sort of, havens registered in the U.S. It's the sheer industrial scale of it, right? It's the fact that you can just pull off the shelf, a volume of hundreds of shell corporations ready to go, ready to be used. And I think that's what surprised people, just how, industrial that this had become, in that just routine and sort of matter of fact. And so again, I think that's a kind of a global issue, and work can be done by different investigative reporters in all these different locales to sort of trace these as we get more, open data sources and more sort of access to these registries.
Miriam, do you want to respond, and then we'll
respond? Just I don't know very much about Pakistan. I just on the point about poverty is that there's resources that could have gone into roads or sanitation or education, healthcare, anything else. And I don't know to what degree that's relevant to Pakistan, but the point is that resources are being diverted from any kind of legitimate purpose that would actually help these societies advance, and are being sent off into the West. On Russia, I mean, Russia used to be safe, but Istanbul used to be safe.
Good point,
and there's this kind of, I don't know if it's that Russia became closer to Central Asia, or just the world in general became more dangerous. The idea that you had a Tajik opposition leader shot in Istanbul. And in general, there's been the perception. I don't know if there's been extraditions, but Istanbul used to be an absolutely normal place. You could have meetings, you could go. That was right. Moscow was one, Istanbul was another. And now both have become essentially unsafe for Central Asian exiles. So it's just it's really a story of kind of I think closing opportunities in a lot of different places. I don't know if that's what I don't know if it's about a Russia model. Of course, if you've been in Central Asia a long time ago, there was already authoritarianism. It's kind of maybe a more confident authoritarianism, and one that has greater inroads into the West and tries to kind of assert itself more. But certainly the Central Asians were deeply authoritarian all on their own before Putin came along.
I think given Russia's position, it takes a leadership role in challenging regional and international institutions in ways that some of the smaller authoritarian states can't, and therefore kind of cuts a path. And that's certainly been part of the trend in the last decade. I'd note, Miriam, you mentioned Turkey, but what we've seen in Ukraine just recently for political oppositionists and journalists, what we see in and around China, where these things are happening with basically political opponents. I would say the expectation that these things shouldn't happen has changed quite a bit in recent years. And it, in a way, supports what you're saying, that actually it's more dangerous because there isn't pushback, and the forces that seem willing to go after political opponents feel as though they don't really have a price to pay. I would suggest, if there are questions, we take the last handful of questions, and then we'll allow the panelists to respond if they're there. Let's take one here, and then we'll take one there. And if those are the last two, I'll then let the panelists respond to them.
Hi, Mohammed Tahir from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Very quick question. Miriam already raised that. That's why Turkmenistan is missing from the book.
What was the first part?
Why Turkmenistan missing?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, from the book. Thank you.
Yeah, all right, yeah.
Thank you. I'm Kate Waters with Crude Accountability. I wanted to get back to some of the points that Marlene made, and also your title, Inside and Outside. Yeah. I guess my question is around who in the West, in your estimation, is benefiting from this closing down space, right? If the resources are coming in, if this is largely about natural resource extraction in Central Asia, I mean, looking at Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, I mean, really all of the countries, maybe with the exception of Kyrgyzstan, although even there we have gold. This sort of what I would call almost like a hyper-legalization of the arguments that as long as it's legal somewhere, we can do it, which has taken over any sort of ethical or moral imperative or even logic, just commonsensical logic about what is right and wrong. And the West seems to be hiding behind these arguments. And I just wonder if you could address that point in your comments. Thank you.
So, Alex, if you want to respond to that,
Sure.
And then Marlene and Miriam.
So maybe I haven't, until I think Miriam sort of formulated for me why didn't we have a Turkmen chapter? Part of what we did here, all of this research is based on public records and public documents, right? There is no private information in here, and it is designed to allow people to then go follow up on this and chase down cases that are of interest. Turkmenistan, there's just not a lot. There's not a lot there. Yeah, there's the great work sort of Crude Accountability is doing, but there's also, the reports about the gas trade and intermediary corporations, about the bank account in Germany, and we include that as an intro, but we don't see the same kinds of vigorous sort of exile politics and dynamics, not in the same way. There's some really fascinating cases, if you want to get techie, Turkmenistan in terms of international arbitration, in cases about sort of, the bit with sort of Turkey and which language should apply, and it's sort of Tower of Babel stuff, but it doesn't pertain sort of to these sorts of direct issues. So I think it was more that it didn't strike us as, there wasn't one obvious kind of case or episode that kind of symbolized what was going on, but we wanted to get the discussion about Niyazov's personal accounts into the book, and so we did it by way of introduction, right? And I really like this formulation about if it's legal, it's okay. I might use that and attribute that to you. I think that's exactly the road that you see in these different sort of sectors and so forth, right? If it's legal, it's okay. And, if it's just a guideline, it's okay to transgress it. If it's a norm, it's okay to transgress it. One of the really interesting things, getting back to policy recommendation Mark was talking about, some of the biggest violators of FATF rules on individual transparency are 3 states in the U.S., company providers in Wyoming and Delaware and Nevada, right? You could have the secretaries of states of these states say, hey, we need to sort of really follow FATF guidelines. I'm not sure that's a politically popular sort of domestic thing for a secretary of a U.S. state anyway to say, but there's sort of fixes there. But I think that's exactly part of the problem that we've gotten in this sort of, we have these professional best codes and best practices, right? And each one of these is a carve-out in the entire sort of system. Who gains from this? Well, sometimes consultants gain. Tony Blair wasn't a massive retainer, right? for the government of Kazakhstan. This kind of image crafting, lobbyist gain, right? Not just for Central Asian countries, for everyone who sort of registers and represents their interests. Bankers, real estate agents, lawyers, accountants, all of these categories of people gain. Yeah, I mean, that seems to, again, sort of be verifiable just looking at some of these particular cases. But again, you're socializing the costs, and that's what kleptocracy does, right? You're stealing from a people. The benefits part we can try and track down and trace, but the harm inflicted, it's a more nebulous kind of thing. Yeah.
So I'll give, if they wish, Marlene and Miriam an opportunity to say a final word before we conclude.
If I may just one comment on what Kate was saying, who gains. I think, in fact, this kind of practices that we see in Central Asia, we have exactly the same in the West. So for me, there is no difference. I mean, you can have a difference of level, but they are the same. On that, they are totally globalized. What makes the difference is not the practices. What makes the difference is that you have some places where you have counter practices, where there are people like you who can denounce, what in Central Asia you don't have. So it's not the practices that are different depending on the place, it's that you don't have the counter society to react to that. And that's the only difference. But the practices are everywhere.
I'm not sure what else to add. I think we've said a lot. It's been a really interesting session.
Good.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I agree. I think it was a fantastic session. I want to thank Alex for a thought-provoking presentation on every level, and thank Marlene and Miriam for really outstanding comments to his presentation. And I'll just remind everyone, Alex has his books for sale in the back, and he's willing to sign them. And let me thank all the panelists and thank all of you.